Good afternoon, Claude.
Good afternoon, Raafet.
I'm very excited to have you here.
Me too. Real honor to be back on my old stomping grounds.
Definitely your old stomping ground. I think the Cubs are here for that.
Exactly. Yeah, we got to promote MIT straight out the gate.
Yeah, exactly. And we've been friends for a long time and for years and years. And I personally couldn't think of a better person to be our inaugural first guest for the MIT New Colossus Project. And I thank you for that, to be part of it.
It's such an honor, but I want to say living up to New Colossus, it's like a big set of expectations. So I'm hoping that I'm worthy of that denomination.
You will do just great. I mean, as you know, the MIT New Colossus Project aims at telling the stories of trailblazing immigrants who came to the United States to understand how they achieved success, but also to inspire the next generation of newcomers and immigrants to the United States to learn from your story and people who have been trailblazing like yourself. So let's maybe dive in, if you don't mind.
Yeah.
Perfect.
Yeah, that would be wonderful.
So actually, I would love to start by going back in time. You have been in New York for
26 years.
26 years,
yeah.
Exactly. And you came pretty much at the same age to New York from London.
Yes.
Right? You came at 27 years old from
yes.
London. You founded your first company, Trace, in London, and you decided to move to the US. What was your expectation coming to the US? What was your dream like, as a new entrepreneur in the media space coming to New York City?
I guess really, if we're going to take it back 26 years, for me, coming to New York was very much like it was for many immigrants. It was the American dream. When I was living in London, I was quite successful in a certain way, but I never really felt like a Londoner. And why did I not feel like a Londoner? It's because my London friends would sometimes speak in their kind of Cockney accent or their estuary accent to just make it really clear that it was them and then there were us who were not really from London. And that is something that really bothered me. Even going back to growing up as a teenager in France, even though I'm a French citizen, when I was growing up as a teenager and went to Catholic boarding school, I always was made to feel that I was a second-class citizen because people would say, you're French, but where are you really from? As in, the really French are the ones who are white French. And I always kind of felt like an outsider looking in. And when I came to New York, the dream was to kind of fit into a subculture, which was a subculture that I felt that I belonged in. And that was a subculture of hip hop. New York was created around the culture of diversity, and hip hop was created alongside the diversity of New York. And this is something that really inspired me. When I came to New York, I was in my mid-20s, as you noted. I really was looking to live an American dream by riding a wave around the potential and the power of hip-hop culture, because I knew instinctively that the subculture was going to go mainstream. There were early signs that hip-hop was going to become a big thing. Mm-hmm. It was initially just about music, but I really hung my hat on the fact that it would be more than music. It would also be fashion. It would also be film. It would also be global. And so that musical art form that was born in New York is something that was exported all over the world. And I wanted to be one of those people who would be the new catalysts in making hip hop mainstream, global, and inclusive of all cultures, and not just Black culture. And I felt at that time that there was no other place I could do that than New York.
That makes complete sense. And in the context of that time, I think that was even more prevalent in the New York, just at that point in time in history.
But I wanted to add maybe one
Sure.
thing, though, about those early months in New York, because I think it's really important when you're an immigrant coming in and you're always kind of feeling like an outsider because you don't know the norms, you don't know the culture, you don't know anyone. I always felt that I could become a New Yorker. And literally, I felt like a New Yorker within, I guess, 12 months. And I always felt like this was my city, I belong in this city, and the city has embraced me in the way that London never did, in the way that Paris never did.
Thank you. Thank you. You know, I mean, listening to you right now, you know, it reminds me that I've always been very impressed by your drive, by actually why you were doing it, why you were pursuing, you know, these ventures, right? And actually, I would like you to actually maybe develop a bit further. You know, of course, you had this passion for, you know, for hip hop as an emerging culture, about, you know, this media world. But can you please maybe explain a bit further what was the driving force behind your media ventures in the early years? Because most of the first part of your career was about trace and media. What was the driving force behind it?
I want to say that it would be a mix of passion and trauma. And I'll start with passion, and I'll get to the trauma later. I had a passion for hip hop. I was what people used to call a hip hop head. And in my train spotting days, I would just listen to every hip hop album I could get my hands on. I was obsessed with the culture, and I knew every lyric to the important records that came out. I used to review hip hop records for the Guardian newspaper in London, and I decided that I should really follow that passion and do what I loved, and then success or money would follow. It was just about pursuing that dream. But from an entrepreneurial perspective and looking at the venture, it really came from trauma, because I grew up in an environment in Togo that is highly unusual. Why is it highly unusual? It's because my mom and dad were never married, and they came from two very different socioeconomic backgrounds. So my mom was a working class woman who never had any sort of formal education to speak of, and my dad was a very successful politician until he wasn't. And I'll talk about the trauma that came from the fact that he was basically pushed out. He was a finance minister when I was growing up in Togo, and I used to navigate those two worlds, the world of privilege and poverty, on a weekly basis. My sister and I would do that. And so my dad, he was sent to Washington as ambassador for Togo when I was 8 years old, and he was a rising star in Togolese politics, and literally right after he turned 50, the president of Togo fired him and forced him to come back to Togo, and he was not able to ever get a job in Togo again. And so basically he became a pariah. So he had his rise and fall, and I was like so traumatized by that experience, seeing my father lose all his power, the little money that he saved up, and saw him struggle to pay for tuition for my sister and I when we were in Catholic boarding school outside Paris. And I felt, even as a teenager, when I was kind of discovering hip hop, that I should become an entrepreneur, because I never wanted any one person to have agency over me, which is why I've never applied for a job. I've never reported to anyone. It's not because I think I'm better than everyone else. It's I really wanted to control my own destiny, and being a founder, even a self-made kind of first-generation founder, kind of seemed like the only path that I should pursue. And that's why I chose to venture into the life of an entrepreneur, which is very much about bootstrapping and struggle and all of that, and I'm sure we'll get into that. But that really was the motivation, really around the passion and the trauma.
Thank you. Thank you, Claude. I think passion and trauma are definitely two forces, right? If used right.
That can motivate you if you can harness them in the right way.
100%. And I think that's really, I think you summarized in a very concise and powerful manner. Thank you for that. And I just want to actually maybe switch gears a bit here and maybe move to another, you know, to when you arrived, and to, because you cannot make it on your own, right? Even if you have all the energy and drive in the planet, you cannot make it alone as Claude, but you need to have allies, you need to have mentors, you need to build community around you. How did you go about that? I know you have, you know, I mean, I've known you for a long time. This is something that you are, you know, you are proud of, and your friends, mentor, and allies are part of your daily lives, and they have mattered a lot to you in your growth, in your success, in your everyday. I would love for you to share with us a bit how you went about it when you came to New York and you knew no one?
It was a journey of discovery because I realized really early on that no dream is too big for New York, but as you said, you cannot achieve it alone. So I set about identifying people who were central to the world that I was working in, and that was the world of hip hop and black culture globally. We could even call it black media and black entertainment globally. And in New York, where a lot of those people lived, I was really intentional about crafting a list of people that I should reach out to. I call those people the arbiters. Those are the arbiters of black culture. Those were people like Spike Lee, who was making films. Those were people in business. Sylvia Rohn was running a record label called Elektra Records. She's now the chair and CEO of Epic Records, which is Michael Jackson's label. Mm-hmm. Those were people like my main mentor, Beth Ann Hardison, who has actually done more than hardly anyone than almost everyone to bring diversity to the world of fashion. So I reached out to these people in order to get to know them. And the way that I got to meet them was sometimes I would just go to events where they were speaking and I would just approach them and know that I'd probably have 30 seconds to interact with them and get their business card and follow up and try to see if they could maybe find 30 minutes in their schedule for coffee with me. So I had a list of people that I wanted to meet because number one, I admired their work. Number two, they had power and influence. And number three, I had done enough research around the fact that I knew that they were givers and not takers. They were people who always found time to help people who were on the up and up, as we would say in the hip hop. Mm-hmm. And even though most of those people rejected me, a lot of them actually did embrace me and believed in my dream. And so within a year, I had met a few people, and then those people introduced me to other people. And within 2-3 years, I knew so many people in New York. The other thing I did was I was very aware of the influence that I had as a magazine editor and publisher. So Trace, which was the magazine that I launched, and that was a monthly style and music publication around hip hop, we would actually organize events every month. We would throw a launch party for each issue, and I would always co-host the issue launch party with whoever was on the cover of that magazine. So I would really be super precise around curating the guest list. So using the star power of the cover star, I was able to attract people to those parties when I didn't know anyone. And as my team grew bigger and bigger, I would have them invite other people, and all of a sudden, we would have a bit of a snowball effect of people who wanted to be in the Trace world, and through those events, we would just kind of interact with a bunch of people and more people, but we made it a mission to know every single person on the guest list because they had to be aligned, mm-hmm. They had to be about the culture, and we also wanted to make sure that we had enough diversity on our guest list that we would bring people together who would have never interacted had it not been for us as the convener. So we would have Goldman Sachs bankers, like aspiring poets, people from the black community, the gay community, billionaires, all kinds of people who would kind of congregate around our Trace events because we really had a clear sense that we were onto something that was quite special and that we were broadening the base of what hip hop was because we were kind of extending our influence into other industries beyond just the core music industry that hip hop operated in.
That's, I love how you, the way you have done it is pretty impressive. And I have to say, when you say you bring poets and Goldman Sachs together in a room, it made me smile.
Yeah, yeah.
I'm a slight bias,
Because, and the reason that was important is because I realized early on that even though New York is so diverse, there's a stratification in New York where, rich people want to be on Park Avenue and some of them don't even want to come downtown. People who live in Brooklyn, they're very just tied to Brooklyn, and we would have our parties mostly always in Lower Manhattan, either Tribeca or Soho or the Village, and East Village, and we would always bring people together because that kind of felt like a new center of gravity.
Yeah. I think that's what you're saying makes a lot of sense. And actually I just want to maybe dig a bit further on this, is obviously you successfully managed to build community and I think diverse communities around you with the sense of mission, aligned with your mission. And here, and you referred to a few people that were kind of crucial or pivotal in your life that I know you love, you have key mentors in your life. And, from the conversation we had over the years, I know these were crucial in your growth and your success. What's your take or understanding of what is mentorship for you and for others, especially in the context of coming to the United States? How important is it?
I think mentorship is very similar to teaching, and I have to make that analogy because we're in a higher education, higher learning institution right now at MIT. I think it's about learning from your mentee and giving back to your mentee. And so in my interaction with my mentors, it was always about a conversation that would feel like a two-way street. So because I was younger than them, they learned something about what was happening on the edge, because a lot of them were already in the stratosphere, so they didn't necessarily have the connection to the edge, or what I'll just call the grassroots in the way that I did, because I was really operating in the grassroots. Mm-hmm. And from them, I learned what it's like to be in the big leagues and what it takes to get to the big leagues. And a lot of the conversation is around sharing life experiences and seeing something in your mentee that either reminds you of you and what you were trying to achieve, or seeing potential that you can help to bring to fruition with just advice and listening. So it's really a two-way street, and I think those are the most successful mentor-mentee relationships. In my examples that I give quite often are the ones around my two Black women mentors. There's actually three, but I'll talk about maybe just two of them right now. Beth Ann Hardison, she's a woman from Bedford-Stuyvesant, right? She doesn't want to call it Bed-Stuy in Brooklyn, she calls it Bedford-Stuyvesant. When I came to New York, she was a model agent, and she really believed in my dream with Trace, and she kind of showed me the ways of New York. Because when I came from London, being an African and just always being super modest, I would always introduce myself as Claude, the editor and publisher of the small independent magazine Trace. He's like, if you're in New York, you don't want to be saying you're the editor and publisher of this small independent magazine. You want to be telling people that you run this magazine that is a style magazine, that is a cultural magazine, that is going to be really big and that is growing really fast, which was true. Mm-hmm. But I kind of always underplayed my achievements in a way that in African culture, you're never supposed to think you're better than anyone else. And this is something that helped me because she showed me the mindset of New York and how you have to kind of project a bigger dream in order to have people follow that and invest in you. Mm-hmm. And that was really helpful. The other mentor that I often mention is Iman. Iman is actually Beth Ann's best friend, and she came to New York in the late 1970s as a model. She's Somali, and she came to New York and she had this incredible career as a model before she became an entrepreneur. And she gave me such great advice on how to adapt to New York as an African. And so the mindset of what Chimamanda, the writer, calls an American African, mm-hmm. which is different from an African American, mm-hmm. is something that Iman and I talked about a lot, and I got a lot from those conversations. Then, when Iman introduced me to her husband, David Bowie, that was also a big thing for me because we would have conversations around what is it like to be so famous and at the same time be so private? Because I was interacting with the world of celebrity, but I had never been close to anybody who was so famous, but who was also very much about being private and protecting your own values as opposed to falling prey to the celebrity culture that was really kind of exploding at the time. Mm-hmm. So that helped me to stay grounded and to be able to move between these different circles, which are the rich and famous and the people who are just the up-and-comers that I always kind of supported. And those interactions really helped me to fit into New York. And even though I was an outsider, I gradually became a bit of an insider, but I would have never been able to do it had it not been for the advice of people who literally took me under their wing and helped me to understand how a city like New York works, and also what it takes to really fulfill the promise behind your ambitions.
Yeah, I think it's the role that mentors and the advice and the time and the generosity they have can really influence lives and career paths and company growth. And from what you're saying and from my own experience, they can really change lives, especially when you come to a new city, a new country like New York or the United States. And thank you for sharing that. I think that's very powerful, and it says a lot about what it can achieve and create.
But I want to interrupt really quickly because I want to emphasize the fact that you chose the word time, because it does take time. This is something that happens over time. You have to invest a lot of time into a proper mentor-mentee relationship. I'll give an example which is related to what I do now. You know, I talked a lot about Bethan, I talked about Iman, I talked about Sylvia Rohn, which are my three main black female mentors in New York. But the person that I work with now, that I told you about a lot, Dick Parsons, who I met more than 20 years ago, and who mentored me over a 20-year period before we became business partners and before we launched the equity lines together. Yeah. He invested 2 decades in our relationship. So it doesn't happen overnight, which is why I always emphasize the word time, because a lot of my mentees now who are in their early 20s, who are starting out as young founders or whatever they might be doing, they just expect things to happen overnight, as if it were a constant state of instant gratification. Yeah. And I explained that you don't build trust overnight. It does take time. And even in my early years in New York, you know, I met people who immediately embraced me and who helped me to do things pretty quickly, but our relationship got stronger over time.
Yeah. I mean, time and trust, I think, are the key here. Yes. to build those relationships. And you're right, there's kind of a dichotomy versus the instant gratification, the trend to instant gratification we're witnessing all around us, and versus, you know, the old ways of, which are actually, you know, sometimes, you know, even in Tunisia, you know, or from our continent is, you know, it's all about trust and bond and that relationship that you build over time. Yeah. Nothing happens instantaneously. Yeah. And I think that's, yeah, I mean, thank you for actually highlighting that. I think it's a key learning and a key insight on that. I mean, maybe you know, you were talking, you know, about, you know, being African and American, and maybe we can, you know, delve into this because it's an interesting topic, and you're not just African, you're not just American, you're also French. And you have lived in Togo, you have lived in London, you have lived in France, and lived in New York. And I know you're proud of every one of these identities. I mean, I know it as a matter of fact. And there is a tendency for newcomers or new people coming to a new culture to try to assimilate by erasing their culture of origin or their previous identity. How do you balance these different identities to let them flourish and be present, whilst at the same time, you know, be part of the American culture, the New York culture, to advance your ventures, your life, so on and so forth?
I've been harping on about, because it's such an important question that I want to be really precise in the way that I answer this. I've been harping on about the fact that I've always been a bit of an outsider. And when I came to New York, in my design for my American dream, I wanted to become a bit of an insider, in the sense that I would be in the mix of things, not just at the center of hip hop, but at the center of youth culture. And my dream at the time was to become a media mogul, right? I never actually did become a media mogul, but I've done well, but I didn't become a media mogul. And I never really did become an insider. Mm-hmm. And I reflected on that. And that's because I'm really comfortable being an outsider, because I've always been an outsider. I've always been different. In France, as I said, you know, I was different because I was from Togo. In London, I was different because I didn't speak with a Cockney accent in London, and I didn't have any of the mannerisms that Brits do, right? In New York, I was different, but New York embraced me, but I was still different in that sense. And I learned to accept the fact that I'm always going to be different. Mm-hmm. It's interesting because even in Togo, where I was born, both of my parents are Togolese, right? And my family name is very well known in Togo because I've had not one but two heads of state in my family. Mm-hmm. Two of my father's uncles were president of Togo. Something really interesting happened about 5-6 years ago. You know, Lomé, where I was born, is on the border of Ghana. So a lot of people kind of moved between the two countries, Togo and Ghana, on a daily basis, because there's a lot of traders who are selling goods on both sides of the border. And so I went to Ghana, and I came back, and normally the immigration officers never check your identification. And mm-hmm. that immigration officer, when I was coming back into Togo, asked to see my ID. And I was like, I'm so surprised. And I was with two people from Togo, and he didn't ask to see the other two people. Mm-hmm. And I said, why you want to, I spoke to him in our main language, Mina, which is the main language of Togo. I said, why are you asking for my ID now? He says, because you walk different from people who are from Togo. And so I want to make sure. And I was so surprised. So even in Togo, I'm an outsider.
Of course, yeah.
And that was so surprising to me. And because I don't necessarily have the vernacular and the slang that the young Togolese have, even in Togo, I'm a bit of a foreigner now. Mm-hmm. And that brought me back to a book that I read when I first moved to London. And it was a book by Salman Rushdie, who's one of my favorite writers. And that collection of essays is called Imaginary Homelands. And it's a book that really shaped my thinking because Salman, being a Brit of Indian origin, always talked about, even if you're in these adopted lands, these homelands, you're always going to be a foreigner. Mm-hmm. And that's okay. It's okay to be British and Indian. And in my case, it's okay to be Togolese and French and American because these hybrid identities that I'm bringing to every conversation, to every nationality, are actually enriching the entire culture versus this kind of nationalistic, monolithic approach to identity and nationality.
I mean, I'm a true believer in what you're saying. I mean, I believe these multiple identities are a richness. They are bringing, those cultures are a boost and a wealth for the nation welcoming them, as well as the ventures and the people around you, and all what you're saying is very profound. And Salman Rushdie is an amazing writer, and I think he encompasses all what you're saying in a very succinct and beautiful way.
But those are part two, because I didn't fully answer your question. Because now that you're kind of weighing in that way, I want to talk about the part two, which is my experience growing up in Paris. Before I discovered Salman Rushdie when I was living in London, a lot of the people that I grew up with who were of African descent, even though they might have been born in France, to your earlier point, they try to erase their African identity. They sometimes chose names that were more French sounding. One of my friends who used to be called Mohammed changed his name to Jean-Baptiste. I'm like, you're a Muslim. How are you going to be named after a Christian saint? Mm-hmm. And I get it. It's because the French Republic is indivisible, which means that your origin should never be above the French identity. Yeah. And so certain people, in order to fit in, right, who are not happy with their status as outsiders, but they really want to fit into French culture, they end up erasing an entire part of their own identity in order to fit in. And this is something that really bothered me. And that's one of the reasons I left France to move to London, because I felt like in a way, London was more embracing than that, even though it had its own problems with identity. And in New York, actually, was where it all came together for me, because there's over 250 languages spoken in New York, and I felt like a lot of people who came to New York who were hardworking were able to find their own space without being kind of erased. And I'll give it a more specific example, which is related to what I'm experiencing with my own 6-year-old son, Jazz, who you know. He's in a public school in New York called the Peck Slip School. And at the beginning of this academic year, there are about 12 migrant children who came to his class who were accepted. They didn't speak a word of English. They had come as migrants from Venezuela and other Central American countries, and they were integrated into the New York public school system. And what was interesting about that approach is the weekly letters that we get from his teacher, my son Jazz's teacher. After these migrant children came, the letters would be in English and also in Spanish. And I just love that. I just love that. Whereas growing up in France, if you don't speak French, you're not living in France. You're excluded from French society, right? And so I want to say that there's a way in our multiple identities, hybrid identities, to be proud of all your identities, because that's what makes all of us stronger ultimately.
I think that sense of pride and ownership, as well as ownership of the identities, of the history, of the legacy of each one of them, I think it's what makes it stronger, makes the group stronger, makes the individual stronger, and that's a very powerful way to go about assuming and integrating into a new country, is by affirmation whilst adapting at the same time. One point actually I would love to maybe, and I might be switching a bit here, and
it's okay to digress.
Yeah, it's okay. It's actually not a digression. It's more, I'm actually wanna, because I think it's a natural segue to something else in terms of coming to, obviously there is the piece where you're building community. There is the piece where you are affirming identity and building identity because you're acquiring a new identity coming to the United States. The other part that I'm actually curious about is about, as an entrepreneur, as a venture founder, and we can talk about Equity Alliance as an example, is the access to capital to fund companies and ventures. And obviously, when you come to a new country, a new environment, you don't have access to native capital because you are new here by definition.
Yeah.
And it is challenging, right? And everyone has his own ways and everyone has his own tricks and his own playbook to work around that. And I know, as you said initially, you were, Goldman Sachs was actually one of your first backers in Trace early on. And Equity Alliance is about bridging the capital access gap itself, your newest venture capital fund. Can you maybe tell us a bit more how you went about that access to capital, how to fund your ventures? Because I think your story and the way you have done it can be very, very powerful.
I think that in this startup culture that we live in now, and I say this because I mentor a lot of startup founders, right, who are early stage founders. There's a culture, which I'll take back to the culture of instant gratification that I mentioned earlier, that expects funding to come really quickly. Whereas I was very much a believer in bootstrapping, and I didn't want to seek any funding until I had some sort of proof of concept. And that meant that I was living hand to mouth. I had roommates in a tiny one-bedroom apartment in Alphabet City on Avenue C, in a neighborhood at that time, full of drug dealers and pimps and prostitutes, people smoking crack on the street corner. This is the sacrifice that I made in order to, number one, assert my independence, and number two, reach proof of concept with Trace. And once there was an understanding in the culture that Trace was doing something different and important, I was confident enough in my ability to ask for money in investment. And so actually, before Goldman Sachs, our first investor is an African-American banker called Ray McGuire. He's now the president of Lazard Bank, and at that time he was working at Morgan Stanley, and he wrote the very first check into Trace, because as an African American man who was born in Ohio, raised by a single mother, who got 3 degrees from Harvard and was working as a top investment banker at Morgan Stanley, he could see that I was onto something important. Mm-hmm. And so that vote of confidence from Ray McGuire allowed us to grow. And by the time we got to Goldman Sachs and were asking for $15 million, it felt like an easier ask because we already had something to show for it. Whereas, a lot of people who don't come with that same kind of immigrant mentality where struggle is part of the story, they just expect, checks to be coming real fast, even though they haven't actually proven anything yet, right? And so the sequencing to me is really important. And I've met many immigrant founders who understand that before you get funding, you have to actually know that you've got something solid. Mm-hmm. It's also because as immigrants, it was really a do or die thing. And we kind of felt that we'd get one shot. There would only be one bite at this cherry. And we needed to make sure that it was the right bite. So in that sense, I feel like the fact that we felt that the rug could be swept from under our feet at any moment, felt that we had to work harder to prove ourselves really early. And then once we knew that we had something, we could attract funding. And then from there, getting $15 million from Goldman almost felt like a formality because we had something quite special, and we were very aware of the fact that we built something quite special.
I think this quality, I don't know if it's the one-way ticket that you take when you come to the United States, and you come here with your dream, with your dream to actually build it, and that willingness to go bootstrap in the beginning to prove the concept, to build it, and then afterwards having this mentality and actually being proud of this mentality, which is actually your strength and the strength of many. I think that's key to actually unlock funding, if I understand correctly, Claude.
Yeah, that's key to unlock funding, but it's also very different from what I saw with American-born founders, mm-hmm. right? Because the culture of venture capital is now so established, they just expect people to write a check early on because that's just how the game is played in America, mm-hmm. right? And with us, we don't expect that. It's almost like the same attitude to credit. I know so many people who came as immigrants and who never got a credit card. Why? Because they couldn't, right? Because we came, we didn't have any credit history, and as a result, we couldn't get a credit card, which means that you had to find other ways to generate funding, yeah. right? Other people funded their ventures with their credit card, right? With credit card debt. I'm like, okay, I didn't know you could do that, but they did. I saw them do it. So it's a totally different approach to risk-taking and reward.
If you go further, actually a few years from the beginning, and again on trying to understand how prevalent is that now, could you maybe develop a bit more about the work that the Equity Alliance is doing on actually giving access to, I would say, more underrepresented minorities, people of color, women, in your investment portfolio? I know your work, and I think it's wonderful, and I know the companies you're invested in. I think they're doing amazing things, and the founders as well. And can you maybe, because I think this is a natural follow on this first, on what you're saying, was the creation of the Equity Alliance to go in that direction. Am I right?
You're absolutely right. The Equity Alliance is a natural evolution of the work that I was doing with Trace, and also with my other media company, True Africa, which is how I produce my films and documentaries and podcasts. It's the same mission, really. The mission of the Equity Alliance is to help to democratize access to capital by delivering superior returns to investors and allowing more women and people of color to participate in the venture capital game. Now, how do we do that? We fund venture capitalists and founders who are women or people of color. And why are we doing that? It's because the studies that came out confirm that white men get more than 90% of the venture capital dollars in America. That doesn't make any sense if you look at the demographic makeup of this country. So we are focused on people who are, as you said, underrepresented, because we believe that great companies are going to come out of these underrepresented environments and also these underserved markets, right? And so it's a very simple thesis, and we're doing very well. It wasn't even my idea. It was Dick Parsons' idea. And again, I talked about the 20-year mentorship that led to us becoming business partners. He's like, we have to do this because it's important, and it's a big part of his legacy. And when we set out to raise $25 million for our Fund 1, we oversubscribed and raised $28 million. And we got very lucky because our very first direct investment in Isuzu, we invested in their Series A, and 6 months later, in January of 2022, they raised $130 million at a $1 billion valuation. So the fact that our very first direct investment became a unicorn is something that, number one, validated our thesis around backing people who are outside of the traditional venture capital financing mechanisms. And number two, kind of showed that, wow, we could actually make real money for our investors while helping to change society. Because Isuzu, for instance, and I always talk about them because I love their business model so much, they allow renters to build their credit by reporting their on-time rent payments. And off of that improved credit score, these renters are now able to get on the property ladder and become owners. So Isuzu is working with the US government via two very important US government agencies, Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, and they're operating in all 50 states, and it's $1 billion company, but that company is just gonna keep growing, and it's gonna be a huge success. So not only are we making money for our investors and for ourselves, but we're, via Isuzu, helping hundreds of thousands of people become owners. And you know how important ownership is to me. I've told you about this, and as opposed to always being a renter, to me, it's that same spirit of affirming your independence through ownership.
I think Isuzu is a wonderful company that you have invested in.
But we've invested in many other companies,
100%.
But that's the one that is really outperforming, and that is such a case study for what we're trying to do.
Absolutely. I agree with you. It's a case study of what you're trying to achieve through the Equity Alliance, which is much broader than that. And I think it's a natural continuation to kind of your trajectory over the last decades coming to the US. And I think, the success you're already having with Equity Alliance is the continuation, and is just a proof of concept itself. You're just proofing that, investment after investment after investment, and you're staying very true to yourself.
But the reality in staying true to ourselves is, if Fund 1, which is this $28 million proof of concept fund, had not worked, we would have just, accepted that we tried and it failed. And I'm totally okay with that, right? It's not everything you do needs to succeed, right? Some things will fail inevitably. But here, once again, because of the fact that our early metrics are really good and we're outperforming, we feel like we can actually build a fund that becomes an authority in this venture capital space, as opposed to the game being only about the Sequoias and Andreessen Horowitzes of this world, the Silicon Valley giants that kind of dominate this industry and share deal flow with each other. So the whole thing becomes so insular that nobody is able or even allowed to penetrate these networks unless they've been endorsed.
Well, absolutely. It makes a lot of sense, and I can definitely see the, kind of the two sides, or the two lands here that you're portraying, and it's good that you're trying to bridge between these two and to bridge that gap. I think it's very important.
Yeah, it is, and you know who is helping us to bridge that gap? And since we're here at MIT Sloan, I have to mention her, Renee Richardson-Gosselin, Professor Renee Richardson-Gosselin, who is on the faculty here at MIT Sloan, has been on our board at the Equity Alliance since the beginning. And as a board member, she's also a sounding board, right? She's somebody that I run ideas by. You know, I gotta really trust her to give us advice on, again, the evolution of capital and social capital and how it all kind of interacts.
Yeah, Renee is wonderful, and I think it's great to have her on your board, and her advice can be very powerful and useful in the Equity Alliance work you're doing. Maybe one last, and actually I want to open up on the last question, and this is more, I just want you to, we started by, we went back in time, and we've done a bit of your story, and we've been through all the learnings that you've had throughout your career, throughout your ventures, and now actually I just want you to, I just want to maybe to see yourself younger, or to see the equivalent of yourself younger coming to the United States and seeing it from your vantage point now. What advice would you give them, if they were coming now to the United States, now that you have built all this wealth of experience, this wealth of wisdom, and all these insights you have built throughout your life? What advice would you give them, Claude?
To my younger self, I would give perhaps just one important piece of advice. And that would have to be around my own experience as an African. I mentioned earlier that when I came to New York, I was kind of always underselling what I did. Oh, I'm the editor and publisher of this small independent magazine called Trace. The other thing that I did in the spirit of African modesty was I was maybe a little bit too polite. And what do I mean by that? Sometimes you have to be unafraid to contradict people who are saying things that don't make sense. But because of the power dynamics that I face in trying to approach new advertisers for my magazine, or big celebrities that I wanted to court for the cover of my magazine, or big time bankers at Goldman Sachs that I needed to invest in my magazine, sometimes I was a little bit too polite in our interactions, and I held back on certain things that I wanted to say. And I wish I had been a little bit more confrontational. Maybe not belligerent, but maybe more confrontational in asserting my own view, as opposed to thinking that because I was an outsider looking in, perhaps I didn't know enough to be able to share my views in that way. And that is something that I regret, and I feel like my trajectory would have been even more singular, and I would have been even more elevated in the world of business had I been able to be a little bit less polite in my interactions with people who are quote unquote powerful.
Do you think this kind of humility, because it's humility, right? And it's also, I mean, it's something that is ingrained in the African culture of humility and of understatement.
Yes.
Versus other cultures in the world. Do you think this humility was a handicap, or do you think it was, it also allowed you to keep the balance between all the things that were happening in New York, the success, and keep everything together? Or how would you see it?
I think it was both a strength, but in many ways it was also a weakness, because I was humble to a fault. I was always humble and hungry, but I was humble to a fault. Because when I look back now at the way that we were raised in Togo and in many other African environments, you're never supposed to contradict the elders, right? Because they know best. And that is something that I have a problem with now. Because I was in my 20s and I was a young entrepreneur, I was a first generation founder who was all about listening and absorbing and understanding how New York City worked and how the world of business worked. Given that I didn't have any businessmen in my family that I could lean on for advice, I sometimes was too humble in my ability to kind of share some of my instinctual readings of the situation, even when I knew much more about the situation than the people that I was interacting with. And that is something that I regret and that I don't do anymore.
I think on this note, I want to thank you, Claude. I mean, I really enjoyed this conversation.
So did I. I thought it was really fascinating.
Absolutely, and thank you for discussing all these points and being honest and truthful about all these parts of your life, and all the different points of them. I think that are going to inspire many, and I'm thankful to you to be our inaugural guest and to be part of this project. I think it is very important, and I want to thank you as a friend anyway.
Yes, thank you. It really is a true honor.
Yeah, thank you, Claude.
I appreciate this.
Thank you.